Today I'm going to read Chapter 2 and 3 of A Long Walk to Water. Chapter 2, Southern Sudan, 2008. Naya put down the container and sat on the ground. She always tried not to step on the spiky plants that grew along the path, but their thorns littered the ground everywhere. She looked at the bottom of her foot. There it was, a big thorn that had broken off right in the middle of her heel. Naya pushed at the skin around the thorn. Then she picked up another thorn and used it to poke and prod at the first one. She pressed her lips together against the pain. Southern Sudan, 1985. Boom! Salva turned and looked. Behind him, a huge black cloud of smoke rose. Flames darted out of its base. Overhead, a jet plane veered away like a sleek eagle bird. In the dark and dust, he couldn't see the school building anymore. He tripped and almost fell. No more looking back. It slowed him down. Salva lowered his head and ran. He ran until he couldn't run any more. Then he walked for hours, until the sun was nearly gone from the sky. Other people were walking too. There were so many of them that they couldn't all be from the school village. They must have come from the whole area. As Salva walked, the same thoughts were going through his head in rhythm with his steps. Where are we going? Where is my family? When will I see them again? The people stopped walking when it grew too dark to see the path. At first, everyone stood around uncertainly, speaking in tense whispers or silent with fear. Then, some of the men gathered and talked for a few moments. One of them called out, "Villages! Group up yourselves by villages. You'll find someone that you know." Salva wandered around until he heard the words, "Loon Arik, the village of Loon Arik, here." Relief flooded through him. That was his village. He hurried towards the sound of the voice. A dozen or so people stood in a loose group at the side of the road. Salva scanned their faces. There was no one from his family. He recognized a few people, a woman with a baby, 2 men, a teenage girl, but no one he knew well. Still, it was comforting to see them. He spent the night right there by the road, the men taking shifts to keep watch. The next morning they began walking again. Salva stayed in the midst of the crowd with the other villagers from Lone Ark. In the early afternoon, he saw a group of soldiers up ahead. Word passed through the crowd. It's the rebels. The rebels who are fighting against the government. Salva passed several rebel soldiers waiting by the side of the road. Each of them held a big gun. Their guns were not pointed at the crowd, but even so, the soldiers seemed fierce and watchful. Some of the rebels then joined the back of the line. Now the villagers were surrounded. What are they going to do to us? Where is my family? Late in the day, the villagers arrived at the rebel camp. The soldiers ordered them to separate into 2 groups, men in one group, women and children and elderly in the other. Teenage boys seemed to be considered men, for boys who looked to be only a few years older than Salva were joining the men's group. Salva hesitated for a moment. He was only 11, but he was the son of an important family. He was Salva Mawen Duit Akirk, from the village named for his grandfather. His father always told him to act like a man, to follow the example of his older brothers, and in turn set a good example for Kaul. Salva took a few steps towards the men. "Hey!" A soldier approached Salva and raised his gun. Salva froze. All he could see was the gun's huge barrel, black and gleaming, as it moved towards his face. The end of the barrel touched his chin. Salva felt his knees turn to water. He closed his eyes. If I die now, I'll never see my family again. Somehow this thought strengthened him enough to keep from collapsing in terror. He took a deep breath and opened his eyes. The soldier was holding the gun with only one hand. He was not aiming it. He was using it to lift Salva's chin so he could get a better look at his face. "Over there," the soldier said. He moved the gun and pointed towards the group of women and children. "You are not a man yet. Don't be in such a hurry." He laughed and clapped Salva on the shoulder. Salva scurried over to the woman's side. The next morning, the rebels moved from the camp. The village men were forced to carry the supplies, guns and mortars, shells, radio equipment. Salva watched as one man protested that he did not want to go with the rebels. A soldier hit him in the face with the butt of his gun. The man fell to the ground, bleeding. After that, no one objected. The men shouldered the heavy equipment and left the camp. Everyone else began walking again. They went in opposite directions from the rebels, for wherever the rebels went, there was sure to be fighting. Salva stayed with the group from Lone Ark. It was smaller now without the men, and except for the infant, Salva was the only child. That evening they found a barn to spend the night in. Selva tossed restlessly on the itchy hay. Where are we going? Where is my family? When will I see them again? It took him a long time to fall asleep. Even before he was awake, Selva could feel that something was wrong. He lay very still with his eyes closed, trying to sense what it might be. Finally, he sat up and opened his eyes. No one else was in the barn. Selva stood quickly, so quickly that for a moment he felt dizzy. He rushed to the door and looked out. Nobody. Nothing. They had left him. He was alone. Chapter 3. Southern Sudan, 2008. The smudge on the horizon gained color as Naya grew nearer, changing from hazy gray to olive green. The dirt under her feet turned to mud, then sludge, until at last she was ankle-deep in water. It was always so much life around the pond. Other people, mostly women and girls, who had come to fill their own containers. Many kinds of birds, all flap and twitter and caw. Herds of cattle that had been brought to the good grazing by young boys who looked after them. Naya took the hollowed gourd that she had tied to the handle of the plastic container. She untied it, scooped up the brown muddy water, and drank. It took 2 gourdfuls before she was a little cooler inside. Naya felt the container all the way up to the top. Then she tied the gourd back into place and took the padded cloth donut from her pocket. The donut went on her head first, followed by the heavy container of water, which she would hold in place with one hand. With the water balanced on her head, and her foot still sore from the thorn, Naya knew that the walk home would take longer than it had coming. She might reach home by noon if all went well. Southern Sudan, 1985. The tears were hot in Selva's eyes. Where had everyone gone? Why had they left without him? He knew the answer. Because he was a child, who might tire easily and slow them down and complain about being hungry and cause some trouble somehow. I would not have been trouble. I would not have complained. What will I do now? Selva took a few steps to see what he could see. On the far horizon, the sky was hazy from the smoke of bombs. About 100 paces in front of him, he could see a small pond. Between the pond and the barn was a house, and yes, a woman sitting in the sun. Holding his breath, he crept closer until he could see her face clearly. Ritual scar patterns on her forehead were familiar. They were Dinka patterns, which meant that she was from the same tribe as Selva. Selva let out a breath of relief. He was glad that she was not Nuer. The Nuer and the Dinka had a long history of trouble. No one, it seemed, was sure where the Nuer land ended and the Dinka land began, so each tribe tried to lay claim to the areas richest in water. Over the years, there had been many battles, large and small, between Dinka and Nuer. Many people on both sides had been killed. This was not the same as the war that had been going on now between the rebels and the government. The Dinka and the Nuer had been fighting each other for hundreds of years. The woman looked up and saw him. Selva flinched at her glance. Would she be friendly to a stranger? Would she be angry with him for spending the night in her barn? But at least he would not be alone now, and that knowledge was stronger than any of the uncertainty about the woman, what she might say or do. He walked towards her. "Good morning, Auntie," he said, his voice trembling. She nodded at him. She was old, much older than Selva's mother. He kept quiet, waiting for her to speak. "You must be hungry," she said at last. She stood and went to the house. A few moments later she came back out and gave him 2 handfuls of raw peanuts. Then she sat down again. "Thank you, Auntie." Squatting on his haunches next to her, Selva shelled the nuts and ate them. He chewed every nut into paste before he swallowed, trying to make each one last as long as he could. The woman sat without speaking until he was finished. Then she said, "Where are your people?" Selva opened his mouth to speak, but his eyes filled with tears again. He could not answer. She frowned. "Are you an orphan?" He shook his head quickly. For a moment he felt almost angry. He was not an orphan. He had a father and a mother. He had a family. "I was at school. I ran away from the fighting. I do not know where my family is." She nodded. "A bad thing, this war. What are you going to do? How are you going to find them?" Selva had no answer. He had hoped that the woman might have some answers for him. After all, she was an adult. Instead, she only had questions. Everything was upside down. Selva stayed in the woman's barn that night. He began to make a plan. Maybe I can stay here until the fighting stops. Then I will go back to my village and find my family. He worked very hard so that she would not send him away. For 3 days he fetched firewood from the brush and water from the pond. But the pond was drying up. Each day was harder to fill the gourds. During the daytime, Salva could hear the distant booming of artillery and the fighting a few miles away. Every shell that exploded, he would think of his family, hoping that they were safe, wondering desperately when he would be with them again. On the 4th day, the old woman told him that she was leaving. You would have seen that the pond is only a puddle now. Winter is coming and the dry season, and this fighting. She nodded her head in the direction of the noise. I will go to a different village near water. You cannot stay with me any longer. Salva stared at her as panic rose inside of him. Why can't I go with her? The woman spoke again before he could ask aloud. The soldiers will leave me alone, an old woman on her own. It would be more dangerous for me to travel with you. She shook her head in sympathy. I am sorry I cannot help you any more, she said. Wherever it is that you walk, just be sure to walk away from the fighting. Salva stumbled back to the barn. What will I do? Where will I go? The words repeated themselves 1,000 times in his head. It was so strange. He had known the old woman for only a few days, but he could not imagine what he would do once she was gone. He sat inside the barn and stared out, looking at nothing. As the light grew dimmer, the noises of evening began. The buzz of insects, the rustling of dry leaves, and another sound. Voices! Salva turned his head towards the sound. Yes, it was voices. Some people were walking towards the house, a small group, fewer than a dozen. They approached Salva, and he took a sharp breath. In the fading light, he could see the faces of those nearest to him. 2 of the men had patterns of V-shaped scars on their foreheads. Dinka patterns again. The kind that were given to boys in Salva's village as a part of the ritual to becoming a man. These people were Dinka, too. Could his family be among them? We'll find out next time.